This is Nick Johnston. Let's go over a few lessons that can be learned from the Johnstown flood of 1889. First up, lesson number 1. Know the threats and risks facing your community. Every community is different. A Category 5 hurricane is unlikely in North Dakota, just like a blizzard is not a big concern in the Florida Keys. Some threats, however, like floods or cyber attacks, are pretty universal. It is important to know what threats are possible in your area, which are most likely, and which have the potential to do the most damage. FEMA has a good resource for that, and you can see the link to that on your screen. In the case of Johnstown, most, if not all of its residents were aware that they lived downstream from a large man-made lake held back by a dam, but they didn't fully appreciate the risk that posed, or just how catastrophic a complete dam failure would be. Having a vague notion that a hazard exists does little if you don't understand the magnitude of the risks it presents to your community. Due in part to past minor floods and previous reports of dam failure that didn't come true, the vast majority of the residents in Johnstown had a false sense of security. Quote, "That could never happen here," end quote, is a common mentality to this day, but it is a perilous and unrealistic way to live. Maybe a disaster won't happen to your community in your lifetime. Maybe it will, but it is important to know what it would look like if it did happen. Lesson number 2. Today, it would be unthinkable to live downstream from a large man-made dam and not have a detailed plan in place in the event of an emergency. We would have a warning system with built-in redundancies, an evacuation plan for both a dry and wet dam failure scenario, and ideally, we would have regularly scheduled exercises and drills to practice how to respond as a community in the event of such a disaster. Johnstown had none of these. Lesson number 3, heed warnings. Even today, people are often reluctant to heed warnings of impending disaster, as many recent examples demonstrate. From Hurricane Katrina to the Joplin tornado to dozens of California wildfires, yes, there were other factors involved, but complacency is deadly. On May 31, 1889, numerous telegraph messages were sent to Johnstown and the communities that lined the narrow valley in the hours leading up to the disaster. Some telegraph operators, such as Hetty Ogle, manager of the Western Union, died at her post attempting to sound the alarm. Despite repeated messages she received to get to higher ground, she stood by her telegraph equipment with unflinching courage, sending words of warning to those in the valley below. Once she had warned every station in the path of the coming torrent, she wired her companion at South Fork, quote, "This is my last message," end quote. And sadly, so it was. For no sooner had she sent the message than the floodwaters engulfed her telegraph office, and she was killed before she could escape. Even more tragically, her words had gone unheeded. This was due, in part, as it is today, to previous reports of disaster that had either turned out not to be true or were not as bad as feared. So when a real catastrophe was impending, the reports were ignored, or in many cases even laughed at. Still today, you often cannot avoid living in a danger zone of some sort, but you can pay attention to warnings. Lesson number 4. Dam maintenance is critical. We know that in the case of Johnstown, dam maintenance was nearly non-existent. The discharge pipes had been removed, the spillways had been clogged with heavy fish netting and later with debris, and the dam had been lowered by several feet in order to widen the road. Even the initial construction of an earthen dam with a wooden core, reportedly filled with mud, brush, hemlock boughs, hay, and horse manure, is enough to make modern engineers cringe. But dam safety is a lesson hard learned. Even in the 20th century, there have been plenty of deadly dam disasters, such as, number 1, the St. Francis Dam disaster near Los Angeles on March 12, 1928. This is also considered by some to be the worst engineering disaster of the 20th century. More than 600 people died when the dam suddenly collapsed. Number 2, the Buffalo Creek Dam. On February 26, 1972, a coal waste dam burst, and 130 million gallons of water and sludge flooded nearby mining towns, killing 125 people, many of whom were children. Or number 3, the Canyon Lake Dam. On June 9th, also in 1972, this South Dakota dam became clogged with debris and failed, flooding many areas of downstream Rapid City and resulting in 238 deaths and 3,057 injuries. As it was in Johnstown, many bodies were never found. Infrastructure maintenance, be it roads, bridges, or dams, remains a challenge in modern society, as it is with anything that requires significant time and money. But dam safety has come a long way. Dams are now broken into 3 classifications based on potential impacts downstream in the event of a failure. Class A, or low-hazard dams, Class B, or intermediate hazard dams, and finally Class C, or high-hazard dams. Class B and C dams require the owner to submit an annual certification to the DEC by January 31st of each year. Class B and C, intermediate and high-hazard dams, also require the owners to submit an Emergency Action Plan, or EAP, to both the DEC and local emergency responders. Such plans outline procedures in the event of either a dry failure, such as in an earthquake, or a wet failure, such as in a flood, and a list of contacts in the event of such an emergency. A list of dams is maintained, and high-hazard dams are routinely inspected to ensure they do not pose a threat to downstream communities. But vigilance is as important now as it ever was. Lesson number 5. Land management matters. Though it was not something that was understood in 1889, land management played an important role in the failure of the South Fork Dam. In the rapid buildup of Johnstown and many of the surrounding communities, trees had largely been stripped from the surrounding hills. This had several negative impacts. First, the lack of solid vegetative cover led to a significant rise in the amount of water runoff resulting from the heavy rains. The ground absorbed less, and a lot more water was poured into the lake behind the dam. And second, it also led to a dramatic increase in the amount of debris, sticks, stumps, and logs, that was washed into the lake, ultimately irreparably clogging the spillway. In modern times, we try to strike a balance between nature and industry. Today, no project moves forward without environmental impact studies, and so-called green solutions are increasingly common. The right land management strategy can help avoid a potential disaster. The wrong strategy can make a disaster far more likely or become a disaster in and of itself. Lesson number 6. Safety requires a degree of oversight. Many blamed the owners of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club for the Johnstown disaster, and while they don't deserve all of the blame, they certainly bear some responsibility. There was no single reason the dam failed, but many of the contributing factors were because of reckless decisions made by the owners of the South Fork Dam and leaders of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Ultimately, the dam failed because it was weak, but it was weak because of the community leadership or lack thereof. Today, laws have changed to hold dam owners responsible for maintenance and accountable for any damages their dam may cause. There is also a degree of regulatory oversight, with organizations such as the DEC prepared to do dam inspections, monitor dam safety, and levy punitive actions against negligent dam owners. But it is important to remember that we cannot simply trust community leaders, business owners, or elected officials to always do what is best for the people they serve. Independent verification is a key component to safety. Finally, lesson number 7, learn from the past. Mitigating future floods is possible, provided you have the will to do it. If you're going to live in a flood-prone area, such as the Conemaugh River Valley, you may want to consider taking steps to mitigate the risk of floods. But permanent flood mitigation efforts can be expensive, and budgets are always tight. Sometimes it takes a disaster, or several disasters, to convince people to take action. When it comes to flood mitigation, that action usually involves the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The history of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can be traced back to the 1700s and the Revolutionary War. In the early 1800s, Congress passed a series of laws that marked the Corps' continuous involvement in domestic civil works. And throughout the 19th century and beyond, engineer officers were involved in the construction, maintenance, and rehabilitation of waterways of all kinds, and for building flood mitigation measures. After the 1889 disaster in Johnstown, the only action taken by the town was the decision not to rebuild the South Fork Dam. But the area was still prone to flooding, and the city experienced major floods again in 1894, 1907, 1924, and then in 1936, the deadly St. Patrick's Day flood. That flood, which killed 25 people, was finally enough to convince the good people of Johnstown to do something. 2 years later, starting in August 1938 and continuing for the next 5 years, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers gouged, widened, deepened, and realigned 9.2 miles of the Little Conemaugh River and encased the riverbanks in concrete and reinforced steel. These measures made Johnstown virtually flood-free for nearly 40 years, until another major flood in 1977 broke 6 dams and resulted in the death of 41 people. Once again, the town rebuilt, flood prevention measures were enacted, and since then, no floods on that scale have occurred. However, as our climate changes, solutions of the past may not always be enough to prevent future disasters, and new solutions may be needed. This concludes my Lessons Learned from the Johnstown Flood presentation. If you would like to know more about the history of this disaster, I highly recommend the book The Johnstown Flood by author David McCullough. Thanks, and have a good day.